Our Bible reading this morning is from Exodus, chapter 20, verses 1 through 17, the Ten Commandments. Then God spoke these words, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents, to the third and the fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 7th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Thus ends the reading.
About 2 weeks ago, the Alabama Supreme Court handed down a ruling that declared embryos created through in vitro fertilization can be considered as children. Frozen children, I guess. And it set off a firestorm of controversy all over the country, with the usual parties on all sides expressing support or outrage. Now, if you think back a few years, it's not the first time that the Alabama courts have set off this kind of controversy. A little over a decade ago, Justice Roy Moore, remember that name, set off a similar kind of firestorm over his attempts to keep a monument bearing the 10 Commandments in his courthouse. Now, the actual weight of the monument that Moore wanted to keep was 5,280 pounds, just a little under 2.5 tons. It works out to about 500 pounds per commandment. And after he lost his fight to keep the monument in his courthouse, which went all the way to the Supreme Court, he made himself a celebrity by traveling all over the United States, lugging his 2,280-pound monument with him. He transported it on a flatbed truck. Joshua Green, writing at the time for the Atlantic Monthly magazine, reported that whenever the flatbed truck returned back to Alabama, it required a 57-foot yellow I-beam crane that spanned the ceiling of Clark's Memorial's warehouse in Birmingham to lift Moore's stone commandments from the flatbed truck and put it on the ground. According to Green, the crane actually sometimes buckled a little under the monument's weight. These monuments that Moore was talking about weren't only in Alabama, they were at courthouses and state houses all over the country. They all appeared in the mid-1950s, actually, to be precise, beginning in 1956. Any of you remember a movie about the Ten Commandments in the 50s, starring Charlton Heston with his square jaw? Cecil B. DeMille, was filming that movie beginning in 1956. And he became aware that the Fraternal Order of Eagles was at that time papering all over America Ten Commandment posters because a Minnesota judge who was a member of the Fraternal Order of Eagles, had become obsessed with putting Ten Commandments in courthouses because he was so offended about a 16-year-old car thief who claimed he'd never heard of any commandment that said it was wrong to steal. So DeMille made an offer to the Fraternal Order of Eagles that they couldn't refuse. If they would do all the work and pay for everything, DeMille would send Charlton Heston himself, or Yul Brynner, who, if any of you remember, he played the Pharaoh, Ramses. Or maybe he'd send Martha Scott, who was Moses' mother, the princess, to selected cities to give speeches about the Ten Commandments when they were donated or erected, as long as the local theaters were also playing the Ten Commandments. It's a brilliant PR move, made a fortune for DeMille. He was hoping it would get an Oscar out of it, but he never got it for that or anything else. Now, DeMille and Roy Moore tell us a lot, I think, about the Ten Commandments, how we are commonly experience them, and how they are often used in our society. It's likely DeMille couldn't even begin to recite half of those commandments, let alone live by them, but he sure knew how to use them to promote himself and present an appealing image of himself and his movie. And as for Moore's 5,280-pound copy of the Ten Commandments, well, doesn't that fit perfectly with how so often people view them? A weight, a dead weight, a heavy obligation, a burden. It seems that's how we think of them, but both those viewpoints really overlook something essential about the Ten Commandments. Back in the mid-20th century, a German Old Testament scholar named Gerhard von Rad pointed out that the commandments are given after Israel is led out of Egypt and set free from bondage. They're given after Israel is no longer a slave people, but a free people, and they've got to form a new society. And they are meant to be the instructions for a free people forming a free society. They're meant to be liberating, not burdensome. Something that sets us free, not something that oppresses us. They're meant to be rules for how a free people live. And it's interesting, John Calvin, who's another of those people we often think of as sort of hard-nosed Puritan, in the liturgies in Geneva, the confessions weren't read before the absolution and the promise of forgiveness to make people feel guilty about what they're not able to live by. Calvin placed them after the confession and after the absolution of sin as a sign of grace. They were meant to be read at the conclusion of a confession to talk about what it means to live as a free people by God's grace. So I want to take a couple of minutes to think about these and give you maybe a different way of thinking about them. It's Lent, and it's a time of Lent when we're invited to reflect on our lives and on the world. And I think the commandments are placed in the lectionary here in the middle of Lent some years to guide us into thinking about how we live as free people, how we live by God's grace. It's easy to take these commandments and kind of dismiss them as not a problem for us, really. Take the first commandment about not having any gods before us. Well, we can say, well, we don't worship Zeus or Jupiter, and we don't make sacrifices to Moloch or some other god, so we must be keeping this commandment. But if the truth be told about most of us, there are a lot of other gods that we're tempted to worship. Money, power, reputation, clothes, appearance, a habit that slowly becomes an addiction, a hobby. Here's the tricky part. Something doesn't have to be bad to become a false god. It could be a good behavior or a good thing, but if we give it too much weight in our lives, if we move it to the center of our lives, so everything revolves around that, we've made it into a false god. There was an exercise I used to do with youth groups where we would draw kind of a donut, and in the hole in the center put God. And then we would create little sections in between the two lines and fill them in with things that we were doing: school, sports, hobbies, family, friends, whatever. And then we asked ourselves, we would have the conversation about, what if you take God out of the center and you stick friends in the center? If you make that the center of your life, what does it do to distort all the other pieces? Or what if you take that out and you put sports in the center, and everything in your life has to revolve around that? Well, what does your life look like? It's a good question to ask. Or take the Sabbath. We can think about it as a day, but I don't know. I read it in the New York Times yesterday. It was a column on rushing. Rushing, being in a hurry all the time. And the columnist talked about how she rushed to get supper ready when she came home from work. She rushed in the morning to get her kids to school on time. She got to work, and she had to rush through all the things that her boss had given her to do. Her day after day were filled with nothing but rushing, hurrying from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. And how, over time, that really distorted her life. There was no time to take a deep breath, no time to pause and think about what life means, and how she needed to evaluate that. I think Sabbath is about that too. We all maybe need Sabbath every day. A time every day where we don't feel like we're rushed and hurried and things are pulling on us, where we can reflect on what we've been doing and what we want to do and who and what is really important in our life, because it's easy to let the urgent push out the important in our lives. Or think for a moment about the honor thy father and thy mother. In her book on the Ten Commandments, Joan Chichester, whose quote we used at the first, suggests this commandment isn't just about our biological parents. It's also, for Moses, a question about what a society, a free society, owes future generations. And she goes on to talk about how sometimes we violate the seventh commandment when we pass on to another generation a degraded environment, or that we don't provide adequate care for the elderly in a society. We're violating that commandment. It's not just about how I'm treating my mom and dad, but it's also about, as a generation, do we care for our parents' and grandparents' generations appropriately as public policy as well as personally? Chichester also says about that fourth commandment about stealing and coveting, that we think of those usually as personal sins, but actually it's a social sin. To take more than we need so that enough isn't available to others is actually a form of stealing. You know, I read a story not long ago about how in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, there are lots of long-term residents who've lived generations in that community that are being forced out because wealthy professionals from places like California come in and they can push up the price of the property so much. In fact, they may buy the house and tear it down and build something bigger. For a vacation home, they're only going to live in a few months of the year, but the prices are escalating so much that the people who live there all the time can't afford it. They don't think they're stealing, but in a certain sense, they are stealing by having so much that there's not enough for others. I once had someone, I used to be in school, one of those people who always had the answer, raised my hand, and eventually I had a teacher that said to me, stop calling on me. You know, and I got kind of upset about this. I was raising my hand, and, you know, other people raised it slower or later, and the teacher called on them, not me, after a while. And I said, after class, I said to her, I raised my hand first. She said, I know, but you always raise your hand. You're stealing from other students the opportunity to share what they know. And I've thought about that a lot. That sometimes by talking too much, I steal from quieter people the opportunity for them to get in the conversation. I had a discussion once in a church about that, about sometimes someone said to me, I've done this so many years, I'm going to stop doing it. I said, you can't stop doing that. Who else will be the treasurer? And they said, I've done it a long time, and it's been good for me. But I've decided I'm stealing the opportunity for someone else to learn to do that, to have the opportunity. Is it interesting that to covet and steal isn't just to, shoplift? It may be something much deeper. The commandments aren't meant as a burden to keep. They're not PR to show what good people we are. They're meant to guide us toward thinking more deeply than we sometimes do about what God requires of us and wants of us, and what will give us joy and freedom in Christ. I hope in the middle of this Lenten journey you take time to reflect on those commandments, not just as laws or precepts, but as maybe invitations to think more broadly about what they might mean for our lives in a way that opens possibilities for you. Amen.